All right. So, welcome everyone. As I said, my name is Jody Dublin. I want to introduce our panelists for today. First up, we have Natalie Fruchter. Natalie is from the Barnard class of 2020 and is currently a third year of clinical psychology PhD candidate at the Furkhoff Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. Natalie completed her master's thesis on the associations between ADHD symptoms, perceptum of respiratory compromise, and illness representations in children with asthma. And she will be presenting her findings at the American Thoracic Society International Conference this May. Wow. Furthermore, she has provided therapy and assessment services at the Max and Celia Parnes Family Psychological and Psychoeducational Services Clinic at Hunter College's Counseling and Anxiety Disorders programs for adolescents and adults. She is also the chair of the executive board of the New York State Psychological Association Graduate Students Division. Welcome, Natalie. Camille. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said thank you.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Camille is a first-year macro student at the Boston College School of Social Work with a concentration in children, youth, and families. In addition to her coursework, Camille is a graduate mentor and a graduate policy intern at the Baker Center for Children and Families. Camille is passionate about community building, racial equity work, and young leadership in service of dismantling systems of oppression. She graduated magna cum laude from Barnard in 2020 with a BA in sociology. Prior to attending graduate school, Camille worked at the Harvard Alumni Association and the American Constitution Society. Originally from Chicago, Camille now lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and spends her free time exploring with her husband, making chai, and creating Pinterest boards. Welcome, Camille. All right, so we're going to kind of start off by just having a few introductory questions. So, and this is for both of you. At what point in your life did you first start thinking about graduate school, and what precipitated those questions for you?
I could go first. I guess I kind of always knew that I was interested in psychology, and to be involved in the field really in any way, you need a graduate degree. So I kind of knew that it was always coming down the pike. And then I guess while I was at Barnard, I really, concretized my interest in pursuing a PhD. I think being involved in just the research on campus and at, other internships that I held made me interested in continuing that work. And I applied in my senior year at Barnard during the pandemic. And it all worked out. So now I'm 3 years in, which is kind of crazy to think about. Still feel like I just graduated Barnard, but I'm almost graduating this program. So a little late for that. But yeah, that's kind of my journey in a nutshell.
I think my answer is similar in that I kind of always knew I wanted to go to graduate school, but the question for me was just which program. So at Barnard, freshman and sophomore year, I was convinced I was going to law school. I had my whole plan, 5 years, 10 years, it was happening. And then I just kind of really embraced looking at what I really wanted to do and the career that I wanted to build, recognized that I wanted to take time between undergrad and graduate school is just to recover. Like Natalie was saying, the pandemic took a big toll on folks. And then really identifying social work as the right program for me. So not only knowing that I wanted to go to graduate school, but spending time thinking about, well, which program in particular.
Yeah, so this kind of goes right into it. I think, especially for your programs, the programs are very focused on your intended career. Psychology and social work, pretty much a straight shot to where you're going. So why don't you talk a little bit about your undergraduate major and how that related to your path of study at the graduate level?
I guess we could just take turns. So at Barnard, I majored in psychology. I also minored in English. Hope that gets credit too. But I guess, a lot of the classes now that I'm taking graduate school classes now are similar. I will say I kind of expected graduate school to be like the same level as undergrad for some reason. Definitely haven't had that experience. I think the classes are just very different in the way that they're structured and in kind of, what's expected of you as a student. But definitely, I still remember certain classes and certain, important things that were taught to me. And I think they've, definitely impacted my work so far in graduate school, which is cool to see.
I think in terms of my undergraduate major, it was in sociology, and that there's definitely a connection to social work, especially macro social work. So I think a lot of folks, when they think of social work, they think about like direct therapeutic services or outpatient services, and certainly social workers are therapists. But what I learned is that there's this whole area of social work, which is macro focused, so very systems oriented in terms of community organizing, policy making, community development, all of these different types of community practice. So as a sociology student, that was definitely my immediate inclination, that big systems level orientation.
And so you would say that your coursework had a very direct relationship, especially for you as a sociology major, thinking about systems of oppression, systems of kind of why things are the way they are. This was a pretty straight bridge for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Did you have to, either of you, did you have to factor in any prerequisites when you were thinking about going to graduate school?
Yes, there is like at least for PhD programs, there is like a list of courses that are required that I wanted to make sure that I took at Barnard or at Columbia, whatever was, available at the time. I think the psychology major generally covered it, but I think specific courses that you could take within the major, I chose because I wanted to cover those requirements.
On my end, there weren't any required prerequisites in terms of applying in the program, which was handy, but I do think there was an advantage. Certainly, I took research studies classes in undergrad, so I'm able to kind of test out of certain classes at the graduate level, but no prerequisites on my end.
Okay, so I want to start thinking about, I guess, the work that you're doing in graduate school right now, the academic work. Um, how did you start thinking about your prospective research interests? I don't know, Camille, do you have a thesis option for your degree? Okay, so how did you start thinking about your research interests related to what you wanted your graduate school project to be?
So for me, I'm, involved in a lab. I kind of apply to a program, but the way PhD programs work, it's just generally like a mentor match. So I was matched in the program, but within the specific lab. And so my program is a clinical psychology PhD, but we have our research all done in the health sphere. So as you could tell from the introduction, my research is on the psychology of asthma and the correlates between medical and psychological conditions there. And so I kind of just pulled from the pre-existing research that was being done in my lab for things that interest me. So I wanted to do some of the research with the kids in the lab that we're doing. So I thought that was interesting, looking at the relationship between ADHD symptoms and asthma, because they're both highly comorbid. And then starting thinking about my dissertation in a similar vein, just looking at the research projects that are done in the lab and seeing what has been done before, what hasn't, and what really interests me in terms of things that I see coming up in my clinical work or just in general.
So did you start thinking about that correlation, which I had no idea about that? Did you start thinking about that while you were at Barnard or some other
Definitely
time?
not. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
definitely not. And I feel like there's all this pressure before you get to graduate school to like know what you want to do in graduate school. I actually was doing an interview for somebody at my program who was applying, and they were asking me, do most people know what they want to do their dissertation on before they come? And I was like, I didn't even know what I wanted to do my master's thesis on or any research. So definitely isn't required. I think it's also so program specific. So
Mhm.
unless you're only applying to programs with the specific research focus in mind, then you're going to have to be flexible early on. But I think in the same way, there's always room for growth. And I think if you have a good mentor, they'll make it work for you.
I'll just chime in here if that's all right. So like Natalie said, for master's theses, like there's plenty of time to figure out your area of interest. You don't have to enter a master's or an MSW program with a specific dissertation in mind. I think for me personally, my research interests definitely stem from what I studied at Barnard around social movement development, Black feminism, social organizing. So in my MSW program, I'm especially interested in racism as a predictor of negative mental health outcomes for people of color and for Black folks in particular, and how we can build interventions that can support the mental health of Black folks. And in particular, recognizing that a lot of our clinical spaces are not tailored or most effective for people of color, really community-based supports that support and uplift people of color. So very broadly speaking, that's what I'm interested in.
So we know that at the graduate level, unlike the undergraduate level, we are looking at kind of more of a micro approach. We're not looking for necessarily overall school prestige, but program prestige. Was that something that you were looking at when you were, Camille, when you were looking for graduate schools? Were you looking at a program that would support these specific research interests that you were interested in?
That's a great question. Definitely. Part of the reason that I chose the program at Boston College was by researching faculty and their research interests. And so I identified a faculty of color in particular who were studying what I'm interested in. And also, the fact that Boston College was a top 10 program was important to me, that, it was academically rigorous and producing research on the level that I'm interested in.
So on the same note, when you both were applying to programs, first, how did you choose, like, how many programs you wanted to apply for? And did you reach out to faculty before you were applying, or while you were in the faculty at programs, I should say, while you were in this application process?
Yeah. So I wanted to stay in New York for graduate school, which was definitely not encouraged. I wouldn't necessarily encourage it if you don't have to. But I really wanted to. And so I applied to all the PhD programs in New York. That's why I think my research interests were kind of more varied, and I was more open. I reached out to faculty at each school that I applied to kind of gauge if they were taking students at the time, because again, it was kind of this mentor match. Some were, some weren't. Some people didn't reply back, but I definitely recommend doing that, because I think you can just gauge, from an email, if somebody would be easy to work with. If they don't reply, maybe not so easy to work with, so I definitely think that was a good move. And I ended up at my program for a variety of reasons, but I'm happy with how things worked out. But I wasn't like too particular, because PhD programs, I think they're all really prestigious. So I didn't really, think about like, is it ranked or in any way. I just kind of wanted to stay in New York, wanted to do this program, and kind of went with what worked.
And Camille, I know you kind of talked a little bit before about researching. Did you also reach out to folks?
So like Natalie, I was interested in a specific geographic area, which is Boston. I'm married and my husband is actually in law school, so I couldn't move across the country and leave him. So I applied to essentially like all of the Masters of Social Work programs in Boston, with a particular eye towards top programs. I didn't actually reach out directly to any faculty, but I definitely reached out to current students, to mentors, and just a lot of research more broadly to find the right fit. So also happy with how things worked out.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the conversations that you had with mentors and with current students. Like, I want to know kind of like from the beginning of when you started thinking about going to graduate school, who were you talking to? Was it faculty? Was it your family, friends? Were you reaching out to strangers on LinkedIn? Like, were you waiting on corners to jump out and try to ask people questions? Like, I want to know everything. Tell me everything.
That's a good question. I would say the best advice came from people in the programs, kind of like what Camille was saying. Like, I actually had a really good friend who's in my program who's also a Barnard alum. And so I knew her through that connection. And she just gave me a really honest review of the program and other programs I had applied to, and really encouraged me also to, join her particular lab and work with that mentor. So I would say, those are the people that you can trust the most. They're having the firsthand experience. If you can find them, great. But otherwise, anybody who's in the program is always going to give you a more honest review than the faculty. So just trying to find people maybe on LinkedIn, it's not a bad idea, because, faculty are going to say one thing, but students will always give you the truth about their programs.
I'd agree with Natalie. I think the feedback from current students is definitely important, especially in honestly assessing the program and its strengths and weaknesses. And for me, mentors were also really important. So reaching out to folks, even as far back as, folks who are really influential in my high school career and high school development, and really saying to them, hey, you know who I am, you know what I'm passionate about, you know what kind of career I'm thinking about building. Would this be the right choice for me? What's your advice, honestly? So really looking to those folks that really inspire me and that I'm trying to emulate, and listening to them and what they're saying.
Yeah. So you both spoke very highly about talking to students, which is something I definitely recommend because, they're the ones that know what's going on kind of on the ground. And when you were reaching out to students, what kind of questions were you asking them?
I think with graduate school, a big question is always finances, how do you manage your finances? What do most students do? Do students have jobs? Do people take out loans? Definitely for me, the mentor match, right? Choosing which lab within a particular program that can really impact your graduate school experience. So how do you, suggest I go about that? I guess those are kind of the big questions for me. And also just what is your work-life balance like? I think that was always a question that I asked. Just getting a sense for what their graduate school experience is like outside of being in graduate school.
I would second all of those things and also add, I was really interested in student life and student supports, especially as a student of color. Are there spaces where students of color gather and can feel supported? What is it like to be a Black student on campus at a predominantly white university? So yeah, assessing that honest feedback and getting a sense of the landscape was really helpful for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree, especially for folks from marginalized identities. If you can find folks that share those identities, definitely ask them, what is the vibe on campus? What's really happening? Are there groups? Are there identity focus groups? Are there support groups? Are there just a lot of folks on campus that are dealing with the issues that I'm dealing with? So highly recommend that strategy. And kind of similarly, you both have Camille, you have talked about the fact that you are married and you wanted to be in a certain geographic area. But were there other people outside of yourself that factored into your decision to attend graduate school, whether in a certain place or timing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think certainly the geographic area was important to me, also the timing and that. So my husband is currently a second-year law student at Harvard Law. So I knew that if I entered the MSW program at this time, it's a 2-year program, we would graduate at the same time, which was really nice for setting up our life. So that was a circumstance. Yeah, I think I really was open to allowing this next step in my life to come into fruition naturally. As much as we want to make really strict plans, also just embracing whatever shape life takes, which I know is a very open-ended comment, but everything really does work out the way it's supposed to.
Okay. So, am I still here? I'm going to pause it. Okay. So, how did you, um, okay, so Camille, you kind of already have hinted about this, but I want to know a little bit about what were some of the financial factors that you considered while thinking about attending graduate school?
I could take this one. So PhD programs are generally funded because you're doing research for the government. So not only are they funded, but sometimes they actually pay you a stipend. But the New York PhD programs are quite tricky in that they know that people want to be in New York. And they know that they don't have to pay us because we'll pay to be here anyways. So I knew that because I wanted to go to graduate school right away, making me, a less competitive applicant than if I were to have done a master's program in between or research in between. And also because I wanted to stay in New York, I kind of knew I was giving up that financial compensation that I could have gotten if I applied outside of New York to more competitive schools or waited a few years. And so that's kind of something I knew. I did apply to these funded programs. I will say that they're obviously more competitive. I really didn't hear back from many of them because most of them, expect people to be doing research for a couple of years already to show that, that way they'll want to get good funding from the government and do their research for them. But that was something that I kind of knew going in, and that I would just be taking out loans. And the loans have been great because no interest for the past 3 years. It's like magical. So that's kind of my story, but I think that might be particular to PhD programs, but I'm not entirely sure.
I can just chime in here. So like Natalie mentioned, I think PhD programs are kind of a different ballgame in terms of funding. Like you said, there are more funding opportunities. Masters, at least for masters of social work, you're not getting paid to be a social worker. Social workers do not get paid a lot, so that's not why we're in the business. But for me, finances were definitely a consideration, and I wanted to go to a program that would give me as much money as possible. So really like reviewed scholarship information, fellowship, grants, all of that. And one of the reasons that I chose Boston College was that they offered me a dean's fellowship, which covered most of the cost of my tuition. So there definitely are, financial incentives that can make these master's programs more affordable. But it's just something to think about at the master's level, being creative and planning ahead to make the most of your time there.
Yeah, it's really a challenge at the master's level to find funding. A lot of it is going to be outside funding for folks, really trying to put a lot of different things together. Loans, hey, we got to do it sometimes. And thank you, Joe Biden for keeping up no interest and no payments for the past few years. But that's definitely a challenge that folks brush up against, and it can influence timing, selection of where you want to go, and being in expensive cities like New York and Boston, those loan dollars aren't stretching as far as they can, but you get to live in New York and Boston. So I guess that's kind of the trade-off, right? Okay, so you both went to Barnard. You both are not at Barnard anymore, obviously, because we don't have graduate degrees. Can you talk a little bit about the transition from liberal arts, gender minority, Morningside Heights into graduate school?
I don't know if my experience has changed so much because I'm still in New York. My school is in the Bronx, so kind of the other area in the city, but and also similarly, like in terms of gender, I think most people in psychology, or most people in my cohort at least, are women. I mean, there's 18 of us and 2 men. So I'm still the majority, which is great. And it's a different experience. I think another thing I didn't expect about graduate school is like people are coming at it from different stages of life. So I'm like one of the youngest in my cohort. Most people are like married or like have a few kids. I'm also married, but I don't have kids yet. And so people are just up to different things. And it's different than Barnard in the sense that you're not all living together and like in a dorm and like going to all your meals together. For me, I'm not in class every day. We're on our clinical placements a couple days a week, and we all do our own research. So it's a lot more independent, I would say. I think you still really rely on the people in your class. But you also all come with like this outside life that isn't necessarily shared with everyone. So that's definitely been an adjustment, but I also think I like it at this stage in my life, because I have my friends from Barnard and I have my friends from before, and I think it's nice to have that separation there.
I'll chime in and say that I think my transition from Barnard was a little bit harder, in part because I wasn't still in New York. So I went immediately to DC, then I was in Boston. I'm originally from Chicago. So a lot of jet setting. Certainly, like, all my close friends are still from Barnard. Barnard is always a part of who I am and how I show up in the world. But yeah, I do think it can be challenging. Like Natalie is saying, like, folks are in different places in their lives. Certainly, like, working 9 to 5, I definitely missed the Barnard, just like commitment and analysis and energy. I was like always texting my friends like, oh, I wish there was more Barnard energy in this room. But I think that's also like a challenge and an opportunity to be that Barnard person in the room and to bring that perspective and that dedication to social justice. So that's been motivating me, definitely.
And kind of on a similar note, Camille, in your bio, you talked a little bit about the stuff that you're doing on campus and kind of outside of school. Can you both talk a little bit about how you occupy your very, very limited time outside of, going to school? Are you involved on campus? Are you involved in stuff in the community? Do you still hang out with, especially for you, Natalie, folks that, the friends that you had at Barnard? Tell me what you're up to.
Yeah, so the key in that question is the limited time. So in the limited time that I have, I definitely do still spend time with my friends from Barnard. I live on the east side now, so some of my Barnard friends are still on the west side. They couldn't leave. But I still get to see them here and there, which is really nice. Just getting to know the area, sightseeing. Usually I think I do most things on the weekends. I think during the week, I'm so tired from whatever I'm doing that I just watch TV and go to sleep. But I definitely think I like that I'm still in the local area. Both my family and my husband's family are here. So, get to see them a lot. And I'm involved in some ways on like leadership committees at school, trying to keep that Barnard spirit going. But yeah, limited time, that's really the key. So as much as I can, I also take limited time for myself just to unwind and relax.
Definitely agreed with Natalie on the limited time. Like you were saying in your program, Natalie, I also have like an internship component. So if I'm not at class, I'm probably doing my internship, but in free time, also staying connected with friends. I mean, I think the pandemic, one small benefit is that folks are much more inclined to connect virtually. So FaceTiming, calling friends all the time, exploring Boston. It's a totally new city to me. So that's been fun. And also trying to learn how to cook, which has been somewhat unsuccessful, but I'm trying.
Well, thankfully, there's a lot of good food in these big cities. So, if not, I'm sure Fresh Direct will also deliver to you. So, speaking of being in a big city, I want to know a little bit about what role geography played in your choice of schools. Now, Camille, you already talked about the fact that your husband is in law school in Boston, but there are other places that are close to Boston that maybe you could have picked. And we all love New York, Natalie, so I understand. But I want to know a little bit about what role geography played. Were you thinking about things like political climate, accessibility to your family and friends, like, even the climate? Were you thinking about those things when you were picking graduate school?
Yeah, I feel like you touched on a lot of it. Definitely, my husband has a job here, so he couldn't just leave that. Family's here, friends are here. But then also I, thought ahead in terms of my career. And because I want to ultimately live in New York, the connections that you make in graduate school, specifically in like a PhD clinical program, you're doing all these different rotations throughout graduate school that can ultimately lead to connections later on for jobs. And so if I, make all those connections, let's say in California, but then I want to move to New York, it's hard, to bridge that network that you don't necessarily have. So that was something that I definitely thought about, because it's helpful just to know people at nearby hospitals and say, hi, I did a placement here. I'm looking for a job in this department. Do you know anyone? And everyone's really helpful in that way. So that's kind of what led me to it as well.
On my end, I think geography was important for reasons like we've said, kind of family considerations and just where I already was. I think also just like physically in terms of commuting, I have a car, so that makes life easier, but like, how am I going to get to campus every day? I'm not living in a dorm anymore, so that's a new consideration on the graduate level. And also, like you said, Jody, like the political climate was important to me. So understanding Boston College as an institution, what are their values? Do they have DEI initiative and efforts? What's important to them? And Boston College as a Jesuit institution stood out to me because they really do value philanthropy, they value service, all of this. So even though I'm not a Jesuit and I don't have to be a Jesuit, that really, helped contribute to my decision.
Wonderful. So I want to kind of jump off of something that you just talked about, Camille, which is not living in the dorm anymore. Can y'all talk a little bit about how you got housing after college? Housing is such a big situation here in New York. It can be really tricky, but I want to know from both of you, like, how did you do it?
I can kick us off. I can kick us off. I know New York housing is a whole different beast, so I'll let Natalie take that one. In terms of Boston, I mean, Boston is a super expensive real estate market too, unfortunately. Thankfully, my husband and I were able to access some resources via Harvard Law School, just in terms of understanding what neighborhoods are good places to visit. We joined a whole bunch of Facebook groups to understand where students typically live. At the time, we were living in a different city, so we actually ended up hiring like a realtor just to virtually view places for us, which was super helpful. And she knew our criteria and what we were looking for. And then once we got here, we loved the place and we signed a multi-year lease, which was able to, lower our costs given inflation. So that's a tip, but make sure you like the place first.
Yeah. So New York. So thankfully, my husband has a job, and so that, was helpful in terms of securing an apartment, but we also did sign our apartment during COVID. So similar to Camille, we did like a 1-year lease with a 1-year extension. So we got the cost locked in. So that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So we're a little nervous for what the price uptake is going to be. But ultimately, yeah, it's just like New York is a lot of hunting around for a good deal. I'm hoping that we can find it, but there's also areas around Manhattan that are affordable, and most people, will do that down the line. So open to it.
Yeah, those COVID deals are starting to expire and folks are getting nervous. I know I also moved during in 2021. So I'm just like holding my breath, hoping that no one notices that I'm still here. All right, so let's kind of switch gears completely and go back to when you first started thinking about graduate school. Who did you talk about to this? Like in terms of faculty, we haven't really talked a lot about faculty. Faculty can be a really great source of information for you as you're thinking about graduate school, trying to wrestle with these different topics, telling you about programs. Did you turn to faculty? Can you talk about that a little bit? And then I also want to hear about like who wrote your letters of recommendation and what relationship you had with them.
I'm glad you asked this because I realized that I didn't mention this before. And so a big support for me was my mentor at Barnard, Dr. Michael Wheaton. So he's a clinical psych professor. If anybody listening is doing clinical psych, I would recommend that he be your advisor. Definitely just utilizing the resources that Barnard has, right? I mean, these are people who are professionals in the field who went through the same process. So everybody's always really happy to help because they know how challenging it can be. So we had many meetings, many emails back and forth. I'm still in touch with him today. And so he wrote one letter of recommendation, and then I did 2 research internships kind of during my time at Barnard, and I had the PIs of those labs write letters of recommendation for me. So those were my letters.
On my end, so the MSW program isn't so research focused as a PhD program. So I was really looking to communicate character, values, academic achievement. So I think the scope could be a little bit more broad in terms of letters of recommendation. So I really looked to my mentors to offer those, and they were really happy to do so, very thankful. And then also, because I'd been working full time, I also asked my previous supervisor to speak to my work experience and how that would contribute to my academic interests. So those were the folks that I drew on. But certainly, identifying faculty was really helpful in terms of what I might be interested in studying, their perspective on the institution, and identifying where I'd want to jump in.
Perfect. So I want to switch gears again and talk about campus visits. So I'm a big vibes person, and like I need to know, like, we're talking about apartments and apartment hunting. I need to know what the vibes are. So Camille, you're very brave to do a virtual visit. I couldn't do it. So tell me about, like, did you do campus visits? Were they helpful? What did you gain? Were the vibes good when you went on campus visits? Did you take a school off of your list if the vibes were bad? Let me know.
Yeah, it definitely did campus visits. I think they were just part of like the interview process. So that was also helpful. My interviews kind of happened right before COVID, so got that in person, which is great because I'm not sure if so many places do in-person interviews anymore. So definitely, like in the world of psychology, there are different fields to programs. So my program is very CBT oriented. We follow the science practitioner model, and then there are other programs that are more psychodynamic. And so I definitely got a sense of that during interviews. In the more psychodynamic places, they would ask you more personal questions, just more of like a get to know you, as opposed to asking about your experiences and your CV. So that was something that, I was less interested in, and I was glad that I had the interview to have that experience. But yeah, also just like getting a sense of like if the faculty is friendly at the place where you are, what the actual building that you're going to spend 5 years in looks like, does it feel like it's falling apart? What's the area that it was around? I remember I went to this one school in Brooklyn, and I just like, I think it was also a dreary day, but it just wasn't like a happy energy. And then I went to this one school in Long Island, and everybody was like really friendly and happy to be there. And they all were like sitting around like a family. So those are just different experiences that I think are great to have in person if you can. But I don't know if they're really offering them nowadays.
Definitely second the importance of vibes and of visiting the location in person. So I definitely walked around campus. I always recommend like picking up a student newspaper, any kind of newspaper, just to get a sense of what people are talking about, what's circulating on campus. And I think also the vibes were important, like Natalie was saying, and like what the program really emphasizes, because you can have programs that look the same on paper, but in actuality, they have different, nuances and inclinations. So especially as a macro social work student, I wanted a program that really emphasized macro social work and wasn't just clinical with like one macro class on the side. So it was important for me to talk to faculty and students and really assess that this was a robust macro program.
Wonderful. So we are about to open up for questions from our audience. But my last question to you is, what advice would you give a Barnard student or alum about how to choose a graduate school?
That's a tough question. I think it totally depends on the field, and what you're interested in are and what your constraints are. But overall, it has to do with like the fit and what you're looking for. So maybe it's a combination of like location, the vibes of the school, the, working style of your faculty mentor, if you can see yourself getting along with the other students in the program, what the program's reputation is like, kind of taking all those things into account, and finances, of course. I think you can't just like look at one thing, because, if you're, let's say, looking for like the most prestigious program, but it's in like North Carolina, right? So that might not be ideal for you, and that's okay. No program is really perfect. And so just accepting that, and knowing that you might be giving up one thing to get another, can make the process much less overwhelming.
I totally second that. And I think my advice too is, even before you pick a graduate program, just to really spend time thinking about graduate school, whether that's, a master's level program, a PhD program, like at any level, this is a significant commitment. And I wouldn't recommend this as something that you do because you don't know what else to do, or you do because other people are doing it, or because your parents think you should do it. Like, these are reasons that do motivate people sometimes, but I really advise folks to step back and think about your why. Why are you pursuing this? How will this contribute to your life? Why does this motivate you? Yeah, and to move from there. And I think if you do, then everything will align.
Those pieces of advice were so perfect. I am not paying either of you, but I definitely would have said the same thing. So thank you. So we are almost at time, but I want to give our audience members time to ask questions if they have any. Just go ahead and unmute, or you can throw it in the chat. When did you start touring campuses? That's a wonderful question. When did you start touring campuses?
My tours were generally centered around like interviews. So when I had an interview, I would like have the interview in the morning, and then maybe like tour in the afternoon, or the tour was part of the interview. So it just depends on like the application cycle, but I remember it being maybe in like the fall or like the winter after I applied. So yeah, I didn't like tour school until I heard that they were giving me an interview, because that would have been a lot.
I agree with Natalie. I think it does depend on the application cycle. I decided to apply and applied and got in rather quickly, like in a matter of months. So I was racing around various campuses. But yeah, I think whenever makes sense in the process, depending on the application cycle. But certainly, like if you're strolling past a campus, feel free to walk around and see what it's like.
Yeah, I think that one of the benefits of being in New York is, first of all, there are a billion schools here. And second, we are very, very, very close to a lot of other schools. So, it can be a day trip, a long day trip to Boston, but it can be a day trip. You can go to Chicago for the weekend. It's not very far. We have tons and tons and tons of schools right nearby. So I always recommend, if you have a long weekend, get together with a few friends. Y'all can share a hotel room, or whatever. Get on the mega bus, and you can do a few campus tours for not that much money. Any other questions from our audience? Okay, so I think that's it. We don't have any other questions. So I want to thank Natalie and Camille for joining us today to talk about their graduate school, choosing their graduate school process. And I hope everybody has a great day today. Thank you.